a look at our next section for Scotland in the First World War. So last week we finished our looking at the impact that Scottish had on society and culture, and you completed your progress checks. What I'll do this week is I'll try and get them marked and I'll get them back to you, but the first ones that I've looked at actually look very good. So what we're going to move on to now is we're going to look at what impact did the First World War have on politics, and what I mean by that is how people viewed the politics of Scotland and what impact did the war have on people changing their political attitudes. So the first section that we're going to look at in this topic is something called the Rent Strikes. Now, the Rent Strikes took place in 1915, so very much at the beginning of the war. And the Rent Strikes are very interesting because it's the first time that women get actively involved in sort of political struggles in Scotland, and it was very much influenced by the First World War and the impact that had. So let's have a look then at the Rent Strikes and what they are. So what are our learning intentions for this week? So our learning intentions, so we're learning obviously about the Rent Strikes in 1915. And what we mean by that is we're learning to describe them, learn the events, the impact that had, and what skills are we developing this week. So what we're learning to do, so we're going to work on reading historical texts for learning through annotation and summary. So we're going to look at complex historical texts. We're going to work on a way of being able to answer that. And crucially this week, we're going to work on a new skill question, a new different type of history question. And this is to write an appropriate response to a compare question. So what I mean by that is we have a question called a comparison question. It's at 4 marks. We're going to be able to write an appropriate response to that. And we're going to be able to use the structure that we do this called OSD. And I'll explain that at the end when we attempt this type of question. So what's our success criteria? So hopefully by the end of this lesson this week, you'll be able to read, give key points and annotate a historical text. You can describe at least 2 events of the Rent Strike of 1915, and you can give at least 2 simple comparisons between historical sources. So why are we learning this though? So what's so important about the Rent Strikes? Why is it important to learn about? So it's one of the first key events we studied that really shows women being involved in the political sphere. Now we will look at other aspects of how women get involved in politics in the First World War, but this is really one of the first events where women take real leadership positions. So it helps us understand upcoming topics that we're going to look at about how women gained the vote at the end of the First World War, and it's also important to be able to work on your skill of being able to read and understand complex pieces of writing. So this will help you in all your subjects, not just history. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what the Rent Strikes are in kind of 3 simple points, just to give us a kind of basic understanding of what we're learning about this week. So if you think about the Rent Strikes, so if we think about industrial areas like Glasgow, the war needed people to be able to work in these factories. It needed people to be able to work in these industrial centres to be able to produce things for the war. So as a result, there was a demand for new workers because they'd lost a number of workers who'd went away to fight on the Western Front. So as a result, people moving into these industrial centres like Glasgow, the demand for housing also skyrocketed. So there's a real demand for housing, so people may be moving from rural areas into Glasgow to work in these factories. They need somewhere to live. So as a result, the landlords who own the houses in Glasgow start to put the prices up of rent. And that's just not for the new people who are moving in, that's people who have lived there before. So women who are predominantly left in these houses feel outraged by this. And as a result, because their men are away fighting their brothers, their husbands, their fathers, etc., they feel that they're being exploited because these landlords think they can exploit women as they won't rise up and fight them again. So in 1915, the local women formed the Glasgow Women's Housing Association to resist rent rises. And what that means is that they essentially refused to pay the new rent that was being forced upon them. And by 1915, we found 25,000 tenants in Glasgow had joined them. So what impact did this have on? It had a massive impact on political society. And it's so much so that they were actually successful. And then the British government passed a new piece of legislation called the Rent Restriction Act that froze rent at 1914 levels. Okay, so this is a very brief overview that I've given you here. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at each of these in turn to see the importance of this and to be able to give us the detail of this. But this is just an overview of what the Rent Strikes were in 1950. So What your first task that you're going to complete this week is you're just going to use the information box to complete 2 simple questions over here in this right-hand box. So why did the landlords begin to change the rent prices? So the landlords began to change the rent prices because we're going to talk about exploiting women, the demand for housing, how many women had joined the rent strike by 1915. By 1915 there were. We'll give that numerical figure of how many were involved in the rent strike. So the second task you're going to look at is you're going to work on your listening skills and be able to actively listen to information that's presented. So what I've got here is I've given a link to a YouTube clip, which is a podcast, a 10-minute podcast about the rent strikes of 1915. And you're going to use this to complete a Cornell Notes slide on the next slide. Now, we've done Cornell Notes before, and so you should be familiar with this. So what I would suggest is you listen to the podcast first. You're not taking any notes or anything. You're just listening to it for the 10 minutes. And then what I would do is I would listen to it again and I would work on taking my notes for this. So in this section, the big section here, you're going to take down the bullet point notes of things that you hear in the video and the podcast. So what are the important notes that you're wanting to take down from that? Then what I would think here is, in this section here, about 3 to 5 questions you could answer using the information from your notes. So maybe you might have a question up here that says, you might have something in here, the rent strikes began in 1915. You might have a question up here that says, when did the rent strikes begin? And then finally, write a summary paragraph of what the information you gained from this video. So try and not look at the questions above. What are the summary points that you would like to remember from this podcast? Okay, so that's the first task, just basing on that. Okay, so the main task that we're going to complete this week is something called directed reading. This is working on our skill of being able to read historical texts for learning through annotation and summary. So what we're going to do is going to do a guided reading or a directed reading. Now, I'll explain what this is, but basically what you're doing is you're going to be given a text that gives you the details of what happened during the rent strikes of 1915. And what I would suggest is you just read it first, just to familiarise yourself with it. Just read it through, and then you're going to complete the task. Okay? So the first task you're going to do is you're going to read it through again, and you're going to highlight the key facts in the writing. Okay? The second one that you're going to do is on the sheet for each paragraph, you must give a heading on the left column, which you would tell me quickly about what the paragraph's about. And then on the right, you're going to summarise the content in 2 or 3 bullet points in the right column. Okay, so here we go. We have the information that you've got here. So if we take this first paragraph here and we think about how we do this, and the titles at the top here give you a clue of what the task is. So if we read this first paragraph, so after the war started in 1914, thousands of workers flocked to Glasgow to jobs in the shipyards and munitions factories. Property owners decided to raise rents, thinking that the demand for housing outstripped supply. As sitting tenants would not pay up, others would. Besides, many men were away fighting or were being held in just German prisoner of war camps, and landlords thought that women would be a soft touch. So what you're going to do is the first one, you're going to highlight the key points. You maybe want to get the dates, you want to talk about maybe the jobs that people are coming to, women being a soft touch. And what you would just use the highlighted tool and the PowerPoint, or you could underline it using the underline tool. Just make sure you're identifying the highlighting the key points from this paragraph. Then what I would do is you're going to add a title. So you might want to add a title, something like maybe 1914, or you might want to add a title that summarises what this paragraph's about. So the origins or the raising of rent, something like that. Just a simple short title to tell you what this is about. And then over here, 2 or 3 bullet points. What's the main pieces of information that you want to gather from that paragraph? Okay, so you might want to do it started in the raising of rent. You might want to talk about flocking to Glasgow for jobs. What are the key points that you want to do? And what you're going to do is you're going to do that for each paragraph. Okay, so you should have highlighting in each paragraph, you should have a title, and then you should have 2 or 3 bullet points for each paragraph. So in total in this text, we've got 5 paragraphs, and you're going to work your way through gathering as much information as possible as you can for that. So what this is allowing you to do is it's allowing you to try and gain as much as possible from this piece of information, because there's lots in here. But if you were just to simply to read it, you wouldn't remember a lot of it. So it's allowing you to engage with it and try and tease out as much information as you can. Okay, so in response to that, what you're going to do is you're going to use the information that you've gathered from the guided reading that you've just completed, and you're going to complete a describe question. So we've done a couple of describe questions here, but I've put here on the slide just some information to try and help think so you can remember the structure that you use to answer this question. So describe the Glasgow rent strikes in 1915. So remember, what we're thinking here about is the 4 reasons. So we're wanting to answer and then point. So one event of the rent strike was, and give 1 point about the topic. Okay, so you might want to put something here. One event of the rent strike was, and then say something about it began in 1915 when landlords raised rents. Okay, so you're looking for 4 different events. Doesn't have to be specific. Just give me events that happened in the rent strikes of 1915. So just tell me about the rent strikes in 1915. Okay, so the final task that we're going to complete this week is our new historical skill that we're working on. And our new historical skill is a compare the views question. So it's called a comparison question. And basically what it's asking you to do is to look at 2 different sources. And in these 2 sources, what you're wanting to do, they'll be talking about the same event or same historical theme. But what it's asking you to do is to identify, do the sources agree about that historical event or do they disagree? And it gives you a very simple structure to help you do this. So it's OSD, overall, simple, developed. So the overall, it's given an overall comparison. Do they mostly agree or disagree on the topic? So you would begin it with overall the sources A and B either agree or disagree on, and then whatever the question's about. So this would be the Glasgow rent strikes of 1915. Then what you're doing is give a simple comparison. Tell me one thing both the sources agree or disagree on. So you might think here about is what is the topic? So if you think both of the sources agree, what is a very similar event that both sources are talking about that they agree on? So it might be something, one thing the sources agree on is that the rent strikes began in 1915. And then finally, develop your comparison. Give me a quote from each source proving your simple comparison. So if you say that both sources that both sources agree that the rent strike began in 1915, what you want to do is just provide a bit of evidence to that to show me that how you came to that conclusion. So source A says, quote, the rent strikes began in 1915. Source B says, the rent strikes began in 1915. Okay, so let's look at how the questions presented them to try and help you organise that. So look here at the 2 sources. We've got 2 sources. What you're going to try and do is you're going to read them. So I would suggest you read them first, and then you decide if they overall agree or disagree about the rent strikes. So let's read them. So in the streets, women carried placards saying we're fighting the Prussians in Partick. Usually the strikers were supported by their employers who did not want productivity slowed down by factors outside their control. Matters came to a head when a mass meeting was held in Glasgow's George Square on the 17th of November to protest against the prosecution of 18 tenants due to appear in court for refusing to pay rent increases. By then, the rent strikes had escalated, with men taking their own wildcat strikes at Fairfields and Beardmores. Rebellion was in the air, but the strikes ended the following month with the government rushing through the Rent Restriction Act. It was a victory for what would later be known as people power. So what we have here is it's giving you some information here about the rent strike. It's talking about how people are refusing to pay the rent. It's talking about how there was a mass protest in George Square. It's talking about how men got involved in striking in shipyards in solidarity. And then finally the Rent Restriction Act that was a victory for the protest. So let's read source B here and then think if it's agreeing or disagreeing. So our committee organised demonstrations with banners demanding the government to take action. There we go, we've got a protest. We informed the Secretary of State for Scotland, Mr McKinnon Wood, that the people desired that the rents should not be increased above the pre-war standard. Rents were still soaring and the events were rapidly approaching a crisis. With the summoning of a number of munitions workers to attend the court, the most dramatic incident of the struggle happened. Men engaged in the work on the Clyde stopped working and marched in their thousands with those summoned to court. As a result of the daring innovation of the rent fiction trials, the cases were dismissed and the rent strikers won a fight which justified the wisdom of the Glasgow Labour Housing Committee. A few days later, an act was to limit the rent increases was produced by the government. So I think it's very clear here that the sources agree. It's talking about very similar issues here about protest. It's talking about how men got involved in striking, and it's also talking about how there was an act introduced to limit the rent increases. Okay, so very clearly agree, and there's 3 simple comparisons. So what I've given you here is just a simple box that you're going to answer your questions. So remember your structure, OSD. So overall, sources A and B agree on the rent strikes in 1915. Sources A and B agree on that there was a protest. Source A states, source B states, and then you would do the similar thing again to get your next 2 marks. Both sources agree that men became involved in the striking. Source A states, source B states. Okay, so I hope this video once again is helpful for you, and to help you organise your answers and give you a bit of context about what we're studying this week. And I hope that you got on well with your work this week. And once again, if you have any questions, please just get in touch and I'll answer them as best as I can. Okay, so good luck with your task for this week, and I will speak to you soon.